And in the skeletal system, most of the skeletal system we'll be doing in the lab. But here I'm going to talk about general parts of the skeletal system, take a few bones, some observations, and then in your notes you have certain terms which are given. I won't be going through all of those terms up here, but make sure you read your notes thoroughly and you know all of that, okay? So let's see how we discuss the skeleton. So when we look at the skeleton, we have axial and appendicular skeleton. And obviously the skeleton consists of bones and cartilages. So the axial skeleton is the skeleton which is in the midline. So it consists of the skull, the entire vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. The appendicular skeleton consists of the skeleton of the limbs, because the limbs are known as the appendages. This also includes cartilages. For example, you'll see cartilages in the thoracic cage. You have the costal cartilages up here. We have cartilage in the nose, cartilage in the ear, and then cartilage in the larynx and the trachea. So it includes those too. We also have a bone which is called the hyoid bone. You'll see when you look at this kind of the entire skeleton, notice that it is kind of connected to one or other bone. So all the bones are connected to each other, one way or the other. There's one bone which is called the hyoid bone, which does not articulate or connect with any other bone, but it is actually suspended from the skull by ligament. So the hyoid bone is a tiny bone which is present just below the mandible. So it's present here, and it's connected to the skull by ligament. So you can actually feel it just below the mandible. If you take your finger, run it down the mandible and come here, there's a tiny bone which you can kind of move side to side, and that's the hyoid bone. So we'll be discussing the different parts of the skeleton. But let's first look at the functions of the skeletal system. Obviously, it's hard, so it's protective in nature. Also provides a framework for attachment of muscles. And since muscles are attached on it and they move these bones, it allows movement, and in part of that movement is locomotion. So you're able to move forwards. Present inside the skeleton, inside the bones, in the medullary or bone marrow cavity, you will see that we have two types of bone. One type of bone is called compact bone, and another type is called spongy bone. Spongy bone has bone marrow throughout life. In compact bone, till about adulthood, you have in the bone marrow cavity, you have bone marrow present, which gives rise to the various blood cells. But after, once you reach adulthood, the bone marrow is replaced by fatty tissue. So there, blood cells are not formed. But in spongy bone, that bone marrow gives rise to blood cells throughout life. So there it begins to form blood cells, and so that is known as hematopoiesis. Poiesis means to form, hemato means blood. Okay? So you can see that bone is an area where blood cells are being formed. The skeleton is also a region where calcium and phosphorus and other minerals are stored. It's a region where calcium and phosphorus and other minerals are stored. It's all here. You don't have to write everything. Okay, it's up here. And calcium and phosphorus, the storage is actually under hormonal interaction. There are two hormones, primarily two hormones in our body. One is known as calcitonin. And the way you can think of it, calci, the word calci means related to calcium. So it deposits calcium into bones, okay? So calcitonin is responsible for calcium deposition in bones. There's another hormone which is called parathormone, or also called parathyroid hormone. Parathormone is another name for it. This removes calcium from the bones. Now you may wonder why would you want to remove calcium from the bones, right? Okay, you can understand you want to deposit calcium in the bones to make the bones strong, but why would you want to remove calcium in the bones? Calcium is not, its function is not only in bone. Calcium has function in passage of nerve impulse. Calcium has a function in neuromuscular coordination, muscle contraction. So it has numerous functions other than just being present in bone. So the blood levels of calcium always have to be kept constant. So when the blood levels of calcium are very high, then what happens? Calcitonin will take that extra calcium from the blood and deposit it in bone. If on the other hand the blood level of calcium is very low, you always want to keep blood levels constant. If the blood level of calcium is very low, parathormone removes that calcium from bone and brings it back into blood. Now during life, calcitonin and parathormone act hand in hand so that we ensure that the levels of calcium in blood remain normal and also that the bone gets adequate calcium deposition in it. Do you see that? Okay. Now calcium deposition is also dependent on a vitamin which is called vitamin D. And vitamin D, if you remember, gets activated in skin, and the presence of vitamin D helps to deposit calcium in bones. It also helps the kidneys absorb calcium and then push it back into blood. So vitamin D is very, very important for this calcium to be deposited in bones. When people live in surroundings where and you get vitamin D when you're exposed to ultraviolet light, because that ultraviolet light, when it shines on your skin, it activates this vitamin D which is present in an inactive form in your skin. So when it gets activated, then it goes through numerous other phases, and then it goes to the kidneys and helps to absorb calcium from the kidneys and helps to deposit that in bone. You may have noticed that whenever you're buying calcium supplements, very often they always will have vitamin D plus, and it's usually D3 plus calcium, right? Because they want to give you both together so that they help you to absorb that calcium. Now, in situations where people live in areas where they're not exposed to sunlight, an example would be if they're living in very crowded surroundings, too many people in a room, and they're always in confines of the room. They don't go out in the sun, and this used to happen very often in the concentration camps, for example, during the World War. So a lot of people crowded in a room, not enough sunlight. The room sometimes didn't have any windows, so they would not get any sunlight. Then they would lack vitamin D. And in such situations, their diet also was, in the concentration camps, their diet also was very poor, so they didn't get calcium too. But the other situation could be that you get enough sunlight, let's say, you're out in the sun, but maybe your diet is not including enough calcium. You're not taking calcium-rich food, like you're not taking milk or other substances which are rich in calcium. So while you get the vitamin D from sunlight, you're not having enough calcium. In either of these cases, or if both are combined, you end up with a condition where bones do not form properly. Bones are very soft, and that condition is known as rickets, because not enough calcium is deposited in the bones. So therefore, the bones are soft, they are not mineralized properly, and this condition is known as rickets. And we call it rickets when it occurs in childhood. And hence, because the bones do not mineralize properly, the child doesn't grow properly. So usually you will see these children with stunted growth, and the weight of the body kind of presses on the lower limbs. So you will often find that their femur, they have a bow-legged appearance, because if the weight is pushing down on the femur, then the femur gets bow-legged. So that's very typical. They usually their skull will kind of look a little big, and they'll have other problems as well. Now, if it happens in an adult whose bones are already formed, then the bones can still get soft, and then we call that condition osteomalacia. So this is softening of bones. which is occurring after the bones have already formed and fused, so after, in adulthood. And since we are talking about calcium and vitamin D, there is also a condition which you should be aware of, which is known as osteoporosis. I'm sure you've all heard of that. This is basically where the bone becomes less dense, hence it becomes brittle. And this is a disease of age. It happens more when it's seen commonly in women after menopause, because in women until menopause our female hormones help to deposit bone help to deposit calcium in bones. It's like they put cash in the bank. So we are kind of protected by our female hormones till menopause. In men, testosterone does the same thing. However, when a woman undergoes menopause, it's a dramatic drop in hormones. You know, her estrogen and progesterone levels drop drastically. In males, there's no drastic drop of testosterone. The male menopause, so to speak, is a very gradual menopause. So, you know, testosterone levels gradually diminish over time. Whereas in females, it's a very drastic drop. So then we don't have this protective influence of progesterone and estrogen depositing calcium in our bones. Our bones keep getting removed, but calcium keeps getting removed but doesn't get deposited. Throughout life, we have deposition and removal of bone occurring side by side. And until menopause in women, our estrogen and progesterone help to deposit more than is removed. But once the estrogen, progesterone is removed, then removal of bone occurs, but deposition doesn't keep pace with it. So with the result, the bones become more brittle. So that's why they say that women are more prone to fractures and such things, or they undergo osteoporosis after menopause, and this is the reason. And very often they take supplements to kind of build up bone, okay? In men, as I said, testosterone levels don't decrease so dramatically, so they are not prone to this. They do, if an 80-year-old man will likely have osteoporosis, but it's not that it's as dramatic as a woman who's, you know, let's say she undergoes menopause at the age of 50, then after 50, osteoporosis will slowly start, you know, creeping up, unless she takes proper supplements, she exercises and does other things to make sure that calcium is deposited in bones. Bones are also an area where growth factors are produced, and these help with various functions in the body. It's also a region where fat is stored, because that bone marrow cavity becomes fatty in adulthood, so fat is stored here. And when you look at bone in the lab, it looks hard, and you know, you can't kind of bend it, you can't really flex it. However, bone consists of calcium, phosphorus and other salts, and those are inorganic salts which form what is called the inorganic matrix. But bone also has collagen fibers in it, because bone is connective tissue. It has collagen, which is the organic matrix. And in life, in your body, it actually gives flexibility to the bones. This doesn't mean, of course, that you can bend the bone, you know, like a horseshoe. But it allows certain flexibility to the bones. The organic, the matrix, which is made up of collagen fiber, that gives flexibility to bone. Wow, okay. I don't seem to have I don't know where that disappeared. But let's see, which of the following best ties the skeletal with the integumentary system? So let me see if I can write some answers here for you. Okay, so let me see. Okay, let's see if you can choose. Nothing's happening? Okay, well, we won't waste time. Let's see, how many choose calcitonin? Just raise your hands. Nobody. How many choose parathormone? Vitamin D? Okay, looks like quite a few people choose vitamin D. And how many choose melanin? No one. And the rest who didn't raise their hands? Okay. Yes, it is vitamin D, right? Because the vitamin D is in an inactive form in the integumentary system that gets activated, then causes calcium to be deposited in bone after reabsorbing and helping with all of that. So that's how it ties in the skeletal with the integumentary system. Okay, what is rickets caused by? So no, here you can answer. Okay, the correct answer is A and B. It's rickets is caused, you need both calcium and vitamin D in order for bone to form properly. So remember I said you could be in a dark place, have enough, drink enough milk with calcium, your bones will not form properly because that calcium will not get deposited. So both lack of vitamin D and lack of calcium can cause rickets. So as everything else, let's look at how we classify bones. So one is a structural classification based on what is the type, how is bone arranged. So based on that, we have bone as cancellous and compact. Compact means it's a very orderly arrangement. And cancellous is where instead of having an orderly arrangement, it's more like a network. And this network has a lot of spaces inside, and those spaces are filled with bone marrow. So here, if we look at this part here, so this part here is compact bone, this area here is spongy bone. So if you look at compact bone up here, notice how it's got these little circles. We'll be looking at them in greater details. You've got these little circles up here. We'll see that these circles are bone plates. It's a very, very orderly arrangement. Whereas here, this is spongy bone, and look at these little sort of finger-like extensions or bone plates. These are known as trabeculae. So it's not in an orderly way, it's a very haphazard way with a lot of spaces in between, and these spaces are filled with bone marrow. And so this bone is not as hard. It's easier to break because these networked trabeculae are easier to break. So that's why this is called spongy bone. And because of these spaces, that's the reason why spongy bone is an area of bone marrow production throughout life. So this is why you see bone marrow in spongy bone throughout life. And as we go along, we'll have certain examples of which bones have more spongy bone and which bones have more compact bone. Now that was based on structure. Here let's look at how we classify bones based on shape. So based on shape, we have bones which are called long bones. These have two ends, so there are two ends to the bone. These ends are known as epiphyses. This is kind of, and the central region is known as the diaphysis. Examples of this, where you have the bone looks long and has two ends to it. Such bones are seen in the limbs. So if you look up here at the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, and then even the bones in your palm, the bones are known as metacarpals. So this part here, where it's called metacarpals. Then in the foot, The same type of bones are known as metatarsals. And of course the femur, the tibia and the fibula. So all the bones of your limbs, most of the bones, not all, most of the bones of your limbs are examples of a long bone. Now we have long bones, so the opposite of long is we have short bones. So they're really small, so they don't seem to have any length to them. Such bones, typical examples of these bones are bones which are seen in your wrist. So this area here, these are called carpal bones or carpals. Bones seen in your foot, in the ankle region, these are called tarsals. So these are examples of short bones. Then we have bones which are flat in appearance. So this central bone in the thoracic cage, the sternum, is flat. Bones on the top of your skull, this top of your skull is also known as the skull cap. So bones of the skull, especially this top, those are flat bones. The ribs are also flat, though actually ribs can be described as long bones, but they are flat to look at, so let's keep them as flat bones. A part of this hip bone, this is the hip bone, this part of the hip bone is flat as well, and this part of the hip bone is known as the ilium. Not the entire hip bone, just that part. And when you look at your scapula, the shoulder blade, again, part of the scapula is flat. So the scapula also is flat, part of it. Flat bones tend to have bone, flat bones are typically made up mainly of spongy bone. So flat bones are typically made up of spongy bone with a thin layer of compact bone on the outside. So in other words, if I take a section of a flat bone, there will be a thin layer of compact bone on the outside, and then inside will be all spongy bone. So therefore, flat bones are sites of bone marrow production throughout life. Right? Because we said spongy bone has bone marrow throughout life. The bone marrow in the skull bones has a special name. It's known as diploi. So the bone marrow in skull is got a special name. It's called diploi. Then another name we give is irregular bones, where the bone has no shape that you can't call it long, short or flat, so you call it irregular. The vertebrae are good examples of irregular bones. You can also have the entire hip bone, because the whole entire hip bone is also irregular. If you just take the entire hip bone or the entire scapula, that also could be irregular. There's a bone in your ankle called the calcaneus, which is the heel bone, but the correct anatomical name is calcaneus. That also is a much larger tarsal bone, so that also has an irregular shape, so we can include calcaneus too in irregular bones. Then we have bone, yes. Yes, only this part on your hip bone, this part which is the ilium, only that is really flat bone. But otherwise you could, if you have to say the hip bone is a flat bone, you have to be specific and say the ilium is a flat bone, okay? But otherwise if you take the entire hip bone, all of it is not flat, it would fit into the irregular category. Now when you look at the skull, and in fetal life the skull, and we'll be doing this, the skull is all, as a fetus your bones are all cartilaginous or membranous, that means like a thin membrane, connective tissue, and then they become bone. So all these skull bones, they were to begin with, especially the top of your skull, they were all membrane to begin with, and then they undergo a process known as ossification where they convert to bone. Sometimes as they are getting converted to bone, small islands may be left out, or they might form separate bones. So instead of forming one bone like this, which is the parietal bone, you'll see the parietal bone, but you might see a tiny little island in the parietal bone like that. It's still part of the parietal bone, but it looks like it's a separate bone. Such bones are known as Vermean bones. Vermean bones, therefore, are bones seen in the skull, which are during the process of ossification or bone formation. During the process of ossification or bone formation, they kind of are ossified separately, and so they have a separate border around them. So during the process of ossification, they form little islands of bone. So these are known as Vermean bones. So normally we have 206 bones in the adult body, but you might have a few extra if you count these Vermean bones, okay? They don't serve any purpose. It just tells you that during ossification, this one took a little longer than this one, and then so, you know, there was a little suture which formed around it. A suture is a joint. No, the soft spot is different, and I'll come to that. Then we have bones in our body, and you all have heard of this bone, the kneecap, which is actually called the patella. This kneecap, and we have other examples of these are bones which are called sesamoid bones, and they grow in tendons of muscles. So this patella actually grows in the tendon of a muscle, which we'll do when we do the muscular system. That muscle is called the quadriceps femoris muscle, the quads as you all know of it, and it helps to prevent friction between the tendon and bone. It helps to increase, sesamoid bones help to increase blood supply to the muscle. So they increase blood supply to the muscle. They prevent friction. In certain areas, these sesamoid bones are weight-bearing. We have sesamoid bones in the sole of our foot, and they help to bear weight. So these are some features and functions of sesamoid bones. And one important thing about sesamoid bones is that all bones have a thin covering on the outside. And that covering on the outside, which we will be seeing soon, is known as periosteum. The word osteum is to do with bone. Peri means around. So periosteum is a thin covering which goes around bone. So it's all around the bone. There is this thin covering, a thin membranous fibrous layer around that. That's called periosteum. Sesamoid bones lack periosteum, so they do not have periosteum, and later we will see what the importance of this is. So sesamoid bones lack periosteum. So now let's look at compact and cancellous bones in more detail. So we've taken, imagine I take a section through any one of these bones. So in the center of the bone will be the medullary cavity. So let's say I take a section and I'm looking from the outside in, okay? So this part all over here, you can see this orderly arrangement. This is known as compact bone. This part you can see is trabeculated, like a network with a lot of spaces. So this is cancellous bone. So let's see what is seen in compact bone. In compact bone, the bone is arranged as plates, and those plates are known as lamellae. Lamella is singular, lamellae is plural. A bone plate in compact bone is just a circular plate like this. So imagine bone has been laid down in this fashion, like a circular plate. So you have these circles going around like this. So here you can see these are all the circles which go around this way, okay? And these lamellae, they are laid around a central canal which is present, which has blood vessels in it. So this central canal, which is seen here, is also known as the Haversian canal. So imagine as bone is being formed, you have a canal which has blood vessels in it. That canal is called the central canal, or also known as the Haversian canal, and around it plates of bone are laid like this. So one such set, which consists of one central canal and all these plates which go in a concentric fashion around it, one such set is known as an osteon. One such set is known as an osteon, or also known as a Haversian system. So you can see here's one osteon, here's another osteon, here's another osteon, or here's one Haversian system, one Haversian system, one Haversian system. And these plates which go around it, these plates we said were called lamellae. Now even the lamellae are given different names. Since these lamellae go around, they're kind of going round and round this central canal, so they're going in circles, these lamellae are known as concentric lamellae. So notice this here, concentric, going around something. So they are called concentric lamellae. Now when you have lamellae like this, so imagine you have these osteons with their lamellae like this, you are automatically going to have spaces in between, because in any space you can't fit circles so well that they completely abut against each other. To fill the space between these osteons, again you'll need to lay plates of bone in between them. So in between the lamellae, the plates that you have that fill the gaps, those plates are known as interstitial lamellae. So interstitial lamellae just fill the spaces between these concentric lamellae. And then on the outside of bone, on the very outside of bone, and on the innermost aspect of bone. So if we take the thickness of bone, so imagine I cut a bone, I took the thickness. So on the very outside up here and on the inside up here, we have these bone plates or lamellae which go all around. So they don't just go around here, but they go around the entire bone like that on the outside, and they go around the bone on the inside. In other words, they're going around the outer circumference and they're going around the inner circumference. Such lamellae are known as outer circumferential lamellae and inner circumferential lamellae. So as the name suggests, circumferential, they're going around the circumference. So they're going around the outer circumference, they're going around the inner circumference. So you have a few bone plates which are on the outside, which are on the inside. So they give good framework to the bone. Then in the middle you have all these concentric lamellae forming the osteons. And to fill the spaces in between, you have interstitial lamellae. Now between these lamellae, the cells, remember bone is connective tissue. So what did connective tissue had? It had cells, it had fibers and ground substance. The cells are the ones which give rise to the fibers and the ground substance. So the fibers are the collagen fibers, and the ground substance is the calcium, phosphorus and hydroxyapatite crystals, all of that mixed together. And so we call these two things matrix. We did that when we did connective tissue. Now the cells of bone are, to start with, there are cells which are called osteoblasts. And these cells lay down the fibers and ground substance. In other words, they lay down the matrix. And when they lay down the matrix, they get caught between these bone plates, and then they are known as osteocytes. So here you can see in between the lamellae, these dark spots which you're seeing, these are all the osteocytes. Now, like any cell, they need nutrition. So they derive their nutrition from this central canal. These cells which are part of this osteon, they derive the nutrition from the central canal because that's where blood vessels are present. Now obviously the osteocytes which are closest to the central canal are best suited to get their nutrition. They are closest to it, right? What about these osteocytes which are so far away? They also need their nutrition. So to help them get their nutrition, you have little channels or little canals connecting one osteocyte to the one next to it. These little canals are known as canaliculi. So canaliculi are little canals which connect osteocytes to one another and to the central canal. So that way the closest osteocytes take their nutrition, and then through the canaliculi they just spread the nutrition for, to the other osteocytes which share it and again spread it on either side. So these tiny thread-like processes that you are seeing up here, these are the canaliculi which are connecting the osteocytes and helping them to get nutrition from the central canal. Now, on the outside of bone, this connective tissue layer which you see here, this is what is known as periosteum. So this part here is called periosteum. And all bones typically tend to have one major blood vessel which goes into it. That major blood vessel you can see here, it's called the periosteal artery, or also known as the nutrient artery. And there's a vein which follows it. This is, and if you look at this picture, you'll see very clearly, this is the artery which is actually going in and then giving branches into the central canal. Can you see that? This is how it's going and giving branches into the central canal and then going into these spaces as well of the trabecular bone. In order to reach from the outside to the inside into the central canal, you can see it has to form little channels which will run in a horizontal manner. So you can see these channels running horizontally and then giving a vertical branch, then going horizontally, giving another vertical branch, and so on, right? So these vertical channels were what were known as Haversian canals or central canals. These horizontal branches, horizontal channels which you see here, which are kind of perforating through bone, these are what are known as perforating canals, or also called Volkmann's canals. So these are known as perforating canals, or also called Volkmann's canals. So if you think of names, you can understand. Perforating, see how they are perforating through bone. See, they are going right through bone. Look at this central canal. It's lying right in the center of the osteon. So that's why central canal will be this one. Perforating canals are these. Now when we look at cancellous bone, on the other hand, it doesn't have this orderly arrangement of osteons. Instead, the bone plates are present as thick plates which are known as trabeculae. The trabeculae will still have the osteocytes and the canaliculi inside them. They'll still have that. But they have lots of spaces in between, and that's where the bone marrow is lodged. So up here we had periosteum, peri meaning on the outside. And over here, lining each of these spaces, we would have something known as endosteum. Endo meaning inside. And if there is a marrow cavity, for example, if we look at a bone where if a marrow cavity was shown, which was this one here, so we'd have periosteum on the outside here and endosteum lining the marrow cavity. So we'll see endosteum lining the marrow cavity. So up here, since we don't have a long marrow cavity, instead we have these spaces, these are lined by endosteum. But otherwise, in a long bone where you have a marrow cavity in the diaphysis, that is lined by endosteum. So let's take a look at compact and cancellous bone.
This is the structure of bone. Spongy or cancellous bone form the center bulk of all our bones. Its honeycomb structure keeps bones light, in contrast to the heavier, compact bone, which gives it strength. Bone cells, or osteocytes, are contained in spaces called lacunae. The minute projections of bone cells trail into adjoining channels known as caniculi. Tissue fluid, which fills the lacunae, allows the transfer of materials between bone cells and capillaries. Habersham systems, each about 1/60th of an inch wide, make up the structure of compact bone. Each system is formed by a series of rings called lamellae, which are deposits of mineral salts and collagen fibers. Habersham canals, which run through the center of each Habersham system, contain the blood and lymphatic vessels supplying the bone. Here, arteries carrying oxygenated blood are shown in red. Veins carrying deoxygenated blood are shown in blue. The lymphatic vessels are shown in white. A section through the shaft of the femur, a long bone, shows a central mass of spongy bone surrounded by the branching tubular Habersham systems. Blood vessels on the bone surface reach into the center of each Habersham system, supplying the bone cells.
The other thing is that bones, when we did cartilage, if you remember, we talked of the cartilage cells when we were doing tissues, cartilage cells lying in spaces called lacunae. Same way, bone cells also lie in a space known as a lacuna. Lacunae is plural, lacuna is singular. So they lie in a little space, and through those spaces is where these canaliculi kind of connect the bone cells to one another and to the central canal. Now let's say you desired to do a bone marrow biopsy. Okay, which of the following bones do you think you would want to select? Let's say you want to do a bone marrow biopsy in an adult, or even a child, but let's say in an adult. And you do a bone marrow biopsy, obviously, when would you want to do a bone marrow biopsy? What are you looking for when you're doing a bone marrow biopsy? Cancer, yeah, but what are you looking for? Blood cells, right? You're looking for blood cells. Very good. You would do it in the sternum. The reason being, when you do a bone marrow biopsy, what does bone marrow contain? We talked of it earlier. Bone marrow contains blood cells. So when you're doing a bone marrow biopsy, you get that. What are you looking at? Blood cells. Now, which is a place where you're sure to find blood cells all the time? In the sternum, because it was spongy bone. Remember, I told you it was a flat bone, and flat bones are spongy bones. Also, think of it logically. You always would want to do it in an area which is accessible. Now, it just so happens that the sternum, which is up here, is accessible at all times. Whether you're fat or thin, it's up here. Imagine you are having to go pierce your skin and go into the radius or the femur, which is your thigh bone. Your thigh is so fat, even in the thinnest person, it's the thickest part of the body, of the limbs. And imagine you've got to take a really long needle to go right through all the muscle and to get into that bone, which would be very, very painful. And if it was an adult, femur in a long bone has more compact. Remember, it had that medullary cavity, which I told you, it fills with yellow bone marrow, so you're not going to get blood cells. And the same goes for vertebra. Again, at the back, difficult to reach. And again, you're not sure you're going to get bone marrow. Bone marrow, however, in a flat bone is the one which is easiest to get. At all times contains blood cells, so you'll find blood cells and you'll be able to do your study. So therefore, you'll choose the sternum. Now, you could have chosen the skull bone too, or you could have chosen the scapula or the hip bone. Now, skull bone, it's frightening to get up there, and the diploid is very little. But we do use the hip bone, the ilium of the hip bone, which I told you was flat. So we often either use the sternum or the ilium of the hip bone to remove bone marrow, because we're sure, since they're flat, we're sure to get bone marrow and blood cells from them at all times during all periods of life. So we described long bones, and I gave you some idea of what a long bone consists of. So the ends were called epiphyses. So this would be called the proximal epiphysis. This would be called the distal epiphysis. The central region is known as the diaphysis or the shaft, and in this diaphysis is where you have the medullary cavity, and that's what I said was lined by end ostium. On the outside, covering the entire bone on the outside, is periosteum, which you can see up here. Now, all long bones are present, as we saw in the limbs, so they form joints or they articulate with bones close by, bones above or below it. Now, whenever a bone articulates with another bone, the word articulate means comes together to form a joint. You don't want bone rubbing against bone. So, what happens is that surface of the bone becomes smooth and it is covered by a layer of hyaline cartilage, which is known as articular cartilage. That's why it's called articular cartilage, because this tells you that this is the end of the bone which is going to form a joint. So this articular cartilage prevents erosion of bone. So it helps the two bones sort of articulate and produce movement in a frictionless manner. As bones are growing in a child, or as I said, as children, our bones are either cartilaginous or they are in membrane form. As bones are growing, that cartilage gets replaced by bone. But we all know that children grow, right? They grow in length or height, and the bones also grow in thickness. So what allows the bone to grow is a piece of cartilage which is present between the two ends of the bone. So here is the epiphysis. Let's say here is the epiphysis at the other end, and here is the diaphysis. So between the epiphysis and the diaphysis at either end is a piece of cartilage which allows the bone to grow in length. That is known as the epiphyseal cartilage, or also known as the growth plate. So as a child is growing, this growth plate keeps forming cartilage and it keeps getting replaced by bone. So that's why, it's like bone keeps kind of playing catch up. So this keeps increasing in length and bone keeps forming. After a particular time, usually around between 18 to 20 years in females and between a little, plus 2 years more in males. Males tend to grow for a bit longer, say about 21 years in males. These growth plates stop producing any more cartilage. So bone growth now catches up and the entire thing becomes one piece of bone. So when the growth plate disappears, in other words, the whole bone becomes now one piece, this growth plate is then replaced by a line which you can see on the surface of bone, which is known as the epiphyseal line. So an epiphyseal line shows you where the growth plate was. Because now, as all of you are here, you're all adults, so you don't have any growth plates in you. Your bones are all one single bone. So the growth plates have disappeared, but the region where the growth plate was, that is represented by a line, and that line is called the epiphyseal line. So you'll see growth plates in children, but you'll see epiphyseal lines in adults. So after between 18 and 21, these epiphyseal lines will begin to appear. As I told you earlier, all bones are supplied by an artery, because bone is extremely vascular. So the artery to the bone is known as the nutrient artery. And usually the nutrient artery kind of tells you which end of the bone is the growing end. By that I mean, remember I said there was a growth plate present here and there's a growth plate present here as well, right? But both growth plates don't fuse at the same time. One end of the bone grows a little longer than the other end. So that end is known as the growing end of the bone. So the nutrient artery, its direction is usually away from the growing end. So if you can see here the nutrient artery is going upwards like this. So for that, this end of the bone would be called the growing end. Typically in the upper limb, the shoulder is the growing end of the bone. So this end tends to grow for a longer time than the lower end. And we always want, as orthopedic surgeons and all, people want to know the growing end of the bone, because if a child has a fracture, children are prone to fractures because, they kind of get into situations where they hurt themselves. So if the fracture involves the growth plate, then growth could be stunted. So you're always worried and you want to make sure that it doesn't involve the growth plate. So they need to know which end is the growing end. I already told you about the hemopoietic function. So here you can see in this, notice that the epiphysis is made up mainly of cancellous bone. That's why you see this network up here with a thin layer of compact bone on the outside. Whereas the diaphysis is mainly made up of compact bone, very little cancellous bone. And this is the marrow cavity, and here you can see yellow bone marrow, so that tells you that it's an adult. So this will also tell you that we said that bone marrow is formed in bones which have a spongy nature. So we saw sternum, we saw the skull bones, we saw the ilium, we saw the scapula. So even the epiphysis of long bones are areas which have more spongy bones. So these are also areas which will have bone marrow throughout life. Now this periosteum, which is on the outside of bone, it's like a thin connective tissue membrane which can easily be stripped off. And you will notice next time you eat chicken at home, or when you remove all the muscle and you're eating a drumstick, try and kind of feel. You'll see this periosteum on the surface of the chicken leg. It comes off in bits. When the chicken is uncooked, it's seen as whole. But otherwise, when it's boiled, it'll kind of come off in bits. That outer layer, which is the periosteum, is kept in place, and it's actually pinned down to the underlying bone by fibers which are known as the Sharpie's fibers. These are perforating fibers, and these are basically from the tendon. Muscles attached to bones. So when a muscle is attached to the bone, its tendon passes these little fibers which go through the periosteum, and they pin it down to the underlying bone. So they prevent this periosteum from coming apart. Okay, I gave away the answer, so let's see if you all were listening. Some people still say make the surface of the bone sharp. I just told you it is to pin the surface, the periosteum, to the underlying bone. So let's look at the cells now of osseous tissue. We talked of two of the cells. So a primitive cell, which is seen in the periosteum and the endosteum. This primitive cell, which is called the osteogenic cell, that means a cell capable of giving rise to genesis, giving rise to cells of the osseous tissue. So that's known as the osteogenic cell or stem cell, and that is seen in the periosteum and endosteum, and these are mitotically active because they can give rise to other cells. And they give rise to, first is osteoblasts. And the function of osteoblasts is to lay down bone. So they synthesize matrix and lay down bone. And so they are responsible for bone growth. When these osteoblasts lay down bone, they get caught between either the lamellae or the trabeculae, and then they become osteocytes. And these osteocytes have these long processes which go into those canaliculi. And the function of osteocytes is to monitor the matrix and make sure that the bone, the mineralization of bone is adequate. If not, it sends messages to osteoblasts and another cell, which is called osteoclast. So this fourth type of cell is an osteoclast, which is a cell which removes bone. Bone resorbing means bone removal. So bone is laid down by osteoblasts, it's removed by osteoclasts. And during life, bone is deposited and removed at the same time. So this deposition and removal, which is called remodeling, kind of goes on all the time, and they keep pace with each other. But like I gave you an example, in osteoporosis, in women after menopause, bone deposition cannot keep pace with bone removal. So therefore removal is more than deposition, and that's why the bone becomes brittle, less dense. So would this be true, this statement be true or false, based on what information I gave you on the other slide, the slide before? This would be true, because here, look at this. I said that this periosteum and endosteum has mitotically active cells, which are stem cells, which give rise to osteoblasts, and they'll give rise to osteoclasts as well. So when you want growth and repair, you want stem cells. You want them to give rise to osteoblasts so that they can lay down. So imagine someone had a fracture. You want the osteoblasts to be produced, more osteoblasts, so that you can form new bone. And you want osteoclasts to be there so that they can remove any excess bone that is being formed, right? So they are, periosteum and endosteum is very, very important for growth and repair. So all this while I told you about ossification, I kept mentioning this word ossification, which is the formation of bone. So this occurs in two ways. Either in the area where bone has to be formed, there is a membrane which takes the shape of bone, and that membrane is developed, and that membrane is replaced by bone. So it's one step process. So bone, from fibrous membrane, bone develops. In the second type of ossification is where you have first a fibrous membrane. That fibrous membrane forms a cartilaginous model, and cartilaginous model then becomes bone. So do you see that? So there's a fibrous model, it becomes cartilage very early in life, so you see a cartilaginous model formed, and then that cartilage gets replaced by bone. So it's a two-step process. It takes a little longer. Now the first place that this ossification begins, it occurs in an area. That area would be called the center of ossification. The first place that this ossification occurs is known as the primary center of ossification. And this primary center of ossification in most bones is seen before birth or in utero. That means in uterine life, when the fetus is still inside the uterus. It's called the fetus when it's in the uterus. Then we have other areas where ossification begins, and these are known as secondary centers of ossification. So these occur after birth. For most, there are few exceptions, but most secondary centers occur after birth. But primary centers of ossification occur before birth, or in utero, or in uterine life. Now, growth of bone can be in two ways. Bone can grow, so if it'll start like this, it'll become like this, and then it finally will get its final shape. So it's grown in length, right? So this kind of growth in length is known as interstitial growth, growth in length. But bone also can grow in thickness. So notice even in this same picture, so from this thickness it's gone here, and then it's gone more like this. So growth around or in thickness is known as appositional growth. Both type of growths will occur as bone is ossifying, both interstitial and appositional growth. So let's look at the first type of ossification, which is membranous ossification, which occurs typically in skull bones, especially these bones of the skull cap, that means the bones on the top, skull bones, and also occurs in the collarbone called the clavicle. So where the skull bones are supposed to develop and where the clavicle is developing, you have membranous tissue, that means fibrous tissue in that area. Certain cells these cells are known as mesenchymal cells. these cells get very, very large, okay? And these cells then differentiate into osteoblasts, and they lay down the matrix. So they get calcium, they lay down the osteoid matrix. So when they lay down the matrix, some cells get caught in between and become osteocytes. Other cells continue to divide, forming more of the osteoid matrix. This drags blood vessels. By formation of this osteoid matrix, blood vessels are attracted to that area. So blood vessels start coming in. So once blood vessels start coming in, this osteoid matrix is now formed around the blood vessels. So little spaces begin to form. And that's how you end up with this kind of trabecular bone. And then on the outside, a thin layer of compact bone is deposited, where instead of forming trabeculae like this, they form those lamellae. So on the outside, you have compact bone, but in the central region, you have trabeculae formed. So this is in the skull bones. You notice I said that that was an area where spongy bone is present. In parts of the clavicle, you have spongy bone. This would be how the sternum would also form. So you have this kind of ossification, which is known as membranous ossification, occurs very fast. The second type of ossification is where first a cartilaginous model is formed, and then that cartilaginous model gets replaced by bone. So here what is not shown is that initially there would be a membrane in that area. So imagine there would be a membrane in that area. That membrane develops into cartilage, so the cells become chondrocytes and a cartilaginous model is formed, which is up here. This cartilaginous model on the outside, the cells on the outside, they differentiate, the chondrocytes, they differentiate into osteoblasts. And they lay down osteoid matrix and form a little collar of bone on the outside, which is known as the bone collar. At the same time, in the center of the diaphysis, so you can see that in the center of the diaphysis, an area in the middle, the cells there begin to differentiate and they form what is called the primary ossification center. So you can see that the primary ossification center is seen in the diaphysis. And as I told you earlier, it appears before birth. So here the central cells, they get very, very large. They begin to get calcium deposited around them. And because calcium gets deposited, the cells die because calcium prevents nutrition from going into the cells. And then these little cavities begin to form over there because the cells begin to die. A blood vessel which is supplying the outer area up here, this begins to get attracted. When the cells die, they release certain chemicals which attracts blood vessels, and the blood vessel goes from the outside towards this central area where these cavities are forming. As this blood vessel goes towards the center, it carries with it these osteogenic cells from this bone collar. So it goes inside, and those osteogenic cells form osteoblasts, which now lay down the osteoid matrix over these dead cells up here. So osteoid matrix keeps getting deposited, and at the same time osteoclasts, which if you remember remove bone, they also remove bone at the same time. So you get deposition of bone, you get removal of bone, so you start forming a big cavity in the center with bone on the outside, and that cavity forms what is known as the medullary cavity. At either end, if you see, there is still cartilage present, and at the two epiphyseal ends, there's still cartilage which is present. So when the child is born, you have this is what the bone would look like. You have the primary center of ossification, bone is forming there, but over here, the epiphysis is still cartilaginous. After birth, a similar process occurs at either end. So again, cells over here begin to enlarge, they drag blood vessels to it, and a secondary center of ossification appears. So here, this area also starts beginning to form bone. But between the epiphysis and the diaphysis at either end, bits of or plates of cartilage are still left, which is known as the epiphyseal plate. And how this helps is that as bone keeps forming at either end, this cartilage keeps forming more and more cartilage cells. So then bone keeps depositing. This cartilage forms more cartilage cells. Bone keeps depositing. So that helps the bone to increase in length, which is known as interstitial growth. Around 18 to 20 years, like I said, these cartilage plates no longer form cartilage cells, so bone then catches up and completely forms bone. So then instead of being in 3 pieces, this will become one entire piece, right? So this is when interstitial growth stops. Appositional growth is when growth occurs as thickness on the outside. So while bone is being deposited this way, it's also being deposited around. So bone increases in thickness as well. As you can see from this picture to this, so bone will begin to increase in thickness as well. So appositional growth continues. So it keeps increasing, and that's how in a young child, a 5-year-old child, you might have the thickness of the bone maybe like say 2 millimeters. By the time the child is say 7 years old, the bone has increased in length but also increased in thickness. So length and thickness both increase. So let's take a look at endochondral ossification.
Bone formation, also known as osteogenesis or ossification, is the process by which bone tissue replaces embryonic connective tissue to form the skeleton. From childhood to early adulthood, ossification lengthens and thickens bone. In addition, the process of ossification is used throughout life to remodel bones. There are 2 methods of prenatal bone formation. During intramembranous ossification, bone is generated on or within fibrous connective tissue membranes. As the process begins, mesenchymal cells differentiate into osteoblasts in regions called ossification centers. The osteoblasts secrete osteoid or uncalcified bone matrix. Over a few days, osteoblasts become osteocytes, and calcium and other mineral salts are laid down, hardening the matrix. The bone matrix develops thin columns of bone called trabeculae, which fuse to form spongy bone. Blood and lymphatic vessels grow into the surfaces of the newly formed bone and develop red bone marrow. Outside of the bone, a dense layer of connective tissue called the periosteum forms. Most outer layers of spongy bone are eventually replaced by compact bone, but the center remains spongy. Intramembranous ossification also occurs with skull bones in childhood. At birth, skull bones are separated by fontanelles, or soft spots, and sutures, immovable joints made of fibrous tissue. Fontanelles in the fetal skull allow for easier passage through the birth canal and rapid brain development. Up until adolescence, the fontanelles slowly ossify into sutures, providing the brain with greater protection. Endochondral ossification, the replacement of cartilage by bone, occurs in most bones of the skeleton. The process begins when embryonic mesenchyme condenses, forming the cartilage model, the shape of the future bone. The model grows within the fetus. Lengthwise growth is attained via interstitial growth. Width is attained via appositional growth. A nutrient artery penetrates the perichondrium, increasing nutrient availability to the cells. Osteogenic cells are stimulated to differentiate into osteoblasts. These cells secrete matrix beneath the perichondrium that forms a thin shell of compact bone known as the bone collar. As the perichondrium begins to form bone, it is now called the periosteum. The bone collar reduces diffusion to the cartilage inside the model, depriving it of nutrients. Capillaries grow into the disintegrating cartilage delivering osteoblasts. The new growth forms a primary ossification center, an area where bone tissue will replace most of the cartilage. Osteoblasts deposit bone matrix, building spongy bone trabeculae. The growing model is gradually remodeled. The cavity fills with capillaries and red bone marrow. Ossification proceeds, forming the main portion of a bone, known as the diaphysis. Around the time of birth, blood vessels enter the epiphyses, the ends of a bone, forming secondary ossification centers. Secondary ossification differs in that no medullary cavity forms, and ossification proceeds outward. As a result, the interior of the epiphysis remains spongy. Secondary ossification leaves a thin layer of hyaline cartilage covering the epiphyses. This is known as articular cartilage, and it reduces the friction and shock in bone joints. The change to the epiphysis also forms the epiphyseal plate, a layer of hyaline cartilage that enables the diaphysis to grow in length.
So here what we are looking at are two x-rays. One is the x-ray of a child and the other one is an adult x-ray. So both these are of a child of different ages and this is of an adult. So we just discussed ossification. So when we were doing ossification and endochondral ossification, remember between the epiphysis and the diaphysis there was that epiphyseal cartilage, and that cartilage kept making more cartilage, and bone as ossification occurred, bone kept kind of replacing that cartilage, and that kind of helped the bone to grow in a lengthwise fashion, which was known as interstitial growth. So here this is an x-ray of a very, very young child, and notice some of the, you cannot see some of these bones here as yet because the cartilaginous pieces haven't yet grown. Whereas in the others, notice for example, notice these phalanges, notice these metacarpals. Can you see that they are in pieces because this is the diaphysis, this is the epiphysis. Here is the diaphysis, here is the epiphysis. Here's the diaphysis, here's the epiphysis. And then down here you can see the radius. This is the epiphyseal end of the radius, this is the diaphysis. Let's take a look at a child who's a bit older where more of the carpal bones are formed. So can you see now all of these are the named carpal bones. So you can see some more have formed. They've yet to ossify fully. But again, look up here. You can see the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and the gap between them is where the epiphyseal cartilage is going to be present. At this point here, this is showing the lower end of the radius, the lower end of the ulna. And here's the diaphysis, here's the epiphysis. And the epiphyseal cartilage is shown by a translucent zone. So here you can see that gap over there. That's not a fracture, but that is where the cartilage is present. Cartilage does not show up on an x-ray as white as a bone does. Instead, it kind of shows up a little what we call radiolucent. It's got a little more transparency to it. So this arrow is pointing to the epiphyseal cartilage in a young child. As this person grows, what happens? The cartilage stops growing, bone growth, ossification kind of keeps up, and these two ends will fuse. And this is what has happened in an adult bone. So here, look at the adult bone. You don't see them in pieces. Instead, you see one complete phalanx, one complete metacarpal. Here you can see the radius, the epiphysis and the diaphysis have fused, and this area which looks a little you can see a little line up here. This line is what is known as the epiphyseal line. So where the epiphyseal or growth plate or epiphyseal cartilage was present, when that cartilage fuses with the diaphysis and is no longer seen, instead you kind of see a line over there. Here is a line. You may or may not see it really well. In a bone, in an actual bone, you'll be able to see this much better. So that is known as an epiphyseal line. So you see the line in an adult, whereas you see the cartilage in a young child. Now, the process of remodeling is something that goes on all the time in our life. Remodeling is where there is bone deposition, which is done by osteoblasts, and bone resorption or removal, which is done by osteoclasts. So take a look up here in bone growth, for example. Here it's showing you epiphyseal cartilage or epiphyseal plate. Here is the epiphysis. Here is the diaphysis. So, this bone is continuing to grow. But as it keeps growing, a lot more, you need to know that this bone was a bit thicker up here, but it needs to be removed. So that's where osteoclasts will come into play, and they remove this part of bone and they give rise to the proper shape that that bone is going to have. So bone deposition and resorption occur throughout life. As we get older, you can see that you're not going to grow in length, but you'll still have deposition of bone on the outside. And that's why in a young child, the more you stress the bone, and by stress I mean good stress, the more you exercise. In young children, the more they exercise, more it stresses bone deposition. So, bones can grow both in length and grow in width. And adults, once your bones have fused, you can understand that one type of growth will not be possible, but you can still have remodeling because bone can still be deposited and removed from other areas, which is why older people, especially when they get real old, we tell them you must always exercise, go on short walks if nothing, so that you're kind of helping this process of remodeling to occur. Now, remodeling is dependent on genetic factors, so it's dependent on the presence of growth hormones, an adequate amount of growth hormone and other hormones. Plus, it's also dependent on genetics. Certain people grow taller than others, and that's based on their genes, because they may have the gene for increased height as compared to someone else. Hormonal factors, for example, growth hormone that I mentioned. We also talked of parathormone and calcitonin, which are the two hormones. One deposits bone and one removes bone. And then mechanical stress that I just mentioned. Stress is always helpful. And by this we mean good stress, like you work out or you go on walks or something. You're stressing the bone and making sure that more bone is deposited and bone doesn't become brittle. We already talked of vitamin D and rickets, the correlation between the two of them. Remember, lack of vitamin D or calcium or both gives rise to this condition called rickets. As you can see in this young child, look at how the bones are bowed. Here it's showing bowing of the forearm bones, but that bowing of the bones in the legs occur too. So that occurs when there's lack of vitamin D or lack of calcium or both. And in adults, that same condition is known as osteomalacia. We've done this before. Now, we have a condition which is a condition of age, which is known as osteoporosis. Since bone deposition and bone resorption occur side by side, if deposition does not keep pace with resorption, that means resorption is more, but you're not depositing as much, bones become less dense, and then you get this condition of osteoporosis. And I think I may have mentioned this earlier. In women, osteoporosis is more common after menopause, because till menopause our female hormones help us to deposit bone. But after menopause there's a dramatic decrease in the amount of female hormones, so they are suddenly withdrawn. So bone deposition can't keep up with bone removal or resorption. So with the result, the bones become more brittle, and that condition is known as osteoporosis. So women are given calcium supplements, told to take vitamin D, go out and exercise. Some may even be given hormone replacement therapy if the osteoporosis is very, very severe. We already talked of these types of growth. Interstitial growth is growth in length, and appositional growth is growth in thickness or width. Now let's say there's a person whose epiphysis has fused. What type of bone growth is possible in such a person, or is there any growth possible at all? the correct answer is appositional growth. You see, if the epiphysis has fused, you cannot have interstitial growth. Interstitial growth is growth in length, and that growth is because of this epiphyseal cartilage, because this cartilage keeps forming cartilage and gets replaced by bone from below. Keeps forming cartilage, gets replaced by bone. So bone keeps growing in length. So that's interstitial growth. But my question was, if this has fused, now you can't form any cartilage anymore, so you cannot have growth in length, but growth in thickness can still occur. The bone can still grow in thickness, and that kind of growth is known as appositional growth. So the correct answer was just appositional growth. You will still have growth. In fact, in a condition which is known as acromegaly, there are two conditions which you'll do more of in ANP2. There are two conditions. One is called gigantism and the other one is called acromegaly. This is because of excessive growth hormone. So in a child in who the epiphysis has not fused and they have an excess of growth hormones, what will happen? Their bones will grow in length, so they'll be very, very tall. So that's why this condition is known as gigantism. Whereas after the epiphysis have fused, so let's say that the epiphysis fused between all of them in the body between 18 and 22 years, and now let's say they get a tumor of the pituitary gland which produces growth hormone. So what happens? They cannot grow in length, right? So their height has already been attained. However, the bones begin to grow in thickness. So what happens there is their mandible, for example, let's say the normal mandibular size is like this. The mandible gets bone deposited on the outside, so it gets much thicker. So their jaw looks much thicker than a normal person's jaw. So it will be really thick like this. So this is because bone is deposited on the outside. Their hands look extremely large because their phalanges and their metacarpals, bone is deposited on the outside. So the bone will be, if a normal thickness of a bone is like this, in these people the bone will be, say, that thick. So bone gets deposited on the outside. So appositional growth is still possible because that is not dependent on the presence of the epiphyseal cartilage. It is dependent on this periosteum depositing bone on the outside, okay? So appositional growth is possible. So that's why in these people the condition is called acromegaly and not gigantism. Now, fractures occur often. Some bones are more frequently fractured than others. The clavicle, for example, is more frequently fractured. And usually in the clavicle, especially in a young child, you have a fracture which is called a green stick fracture. So in a young child, you have a fracture which is called a green stick fracture. And it's like a green stem. What happens when you break a green stem? The outer skin is not fractured. So same way in a green stick fracture, the bone is not fractured through and through, but there's a fracture in the middle. So the periosteum is intact usually. And that's because the bone is still not ossified, it's cartilaginous. But otherwise, in an adult bone, when a fracture occurs, you can see the various stages up here. First, there is blood because the blood vessels in the bone are ruptured. So you get a swelling, that's called a hematoma, which is a collection of blood. After some time, you know, from the periosteum, the cells come in and they lay down cartilage, and then bone begins to form. So here the cartilage forms, and that's called a callus. So it kind of bridges the ends of the bones together. And then this cartilage is replaced by bone itself. So bony callus will form. And then the bone is a bit thicker at this end. And then finally, to make sure that the bone comes back to its original shape, remodeling by resorption occurs. So osteoclasts will remove any extra bone that is laid down in that area, and it will kind of bring the bone back to its original shape. And sometimes you may not even be able to tell that the fracture occurred there. You may not even see the fracture line. So let's take a look at a video on fractures.
The fracture of a bone is usually caused by direct violence or by a strong twisting strain. When a bone fractures, the two fragments separate and in so doing tear the arteries in the Havisham systems that cross the fracture line. This damage results in the leakage of blood into the fracture, where it is trapped and soon clots. After a short time, the Havisham arteries go into spasm, causing the death of active bone cells not only at the fracture site, but also for some distance along the shaft. About 2 days after the break, the blood clot is invaded by capillaries and fibroblasts. The fibroblasts differentiate into bone-forming cells, or osteoblasts, and cells that form periosteal tissue on the outside of the bone. New tissue called callus surrounds the fracture and replaces the dead bone. The dead bone is absorbed and replaced by new bone, formed by osteoblasts in the callus, which is remodeled by cells called osteoclasts to its original shape. This remodeling process is so effective that after a few months it is difficult to detect the fracture site.
So that was in general about bone, and now we are going to be looking at skeleton. I won't be doing individual bones, but we'll be looking at some bones, and wherever I mention important parts and I mention important blood vessels in relation to these bones, it's important that you remember those. This is a picture that you should keep coming back to all the time because it kind of shows you which bones articulate with which bones. So it's a good idea to look at this. Make sure you look at the skeleton in the lab or even in the learning centers. So let's first start with the axial part of the skeleton, and we'll look at the skull. Now, a lot of the skull ossified in membrane, and it was called membranous ossification. And this kind of ossification occurs very fast because it's a one-step process. That membrane is replaced by bone. And so all these flat bones of the skull are ossified in membrane. But in certain areas of the skull, when a child is born, not all of it is yet formed bone. In some areas, the membrane still remains, and that is seen where the sutures are. It's also seen in these little areas which may be triangular or like a diamond-shaped area. These areas are known as fontanelles. So you can see that there is a fontanelle which is present up here in the front. This is what is typically called the soft spot, and you can feel it on a baby's skull. You have fontanelles which are present on the lateral aspect as well. You have a fontanelle which is present on the posterior aspect. So you have many such fontanelles. The purpose of these fontanelles is because the skull is yet to grow. So it allows for skull growth. So it allows the skull to grow. It also allows the brain to grow inside. So as the brain is growing, the skull has to grow with it. So that's why if you have a fontanelle present here, if this area is still membrane, it will allow the skull to grow, and then once that brain growth and brain growth is completed, then these fontanelles can fuse. So these fontanelles begin to fuse slowly by about 18 months to a little beyond. So they start fusing slowly. Some may fuse a little earlier by about 6 months. So that's why you feel that soft spot up here in a young child. You can feel it till quite some time. Another thing that these fontanelles do is that during the process of labor, so another function is during the process of labor, they allow something known as molding to occur. So molding occurs during labor as the fetus is passing through the birth canal. What they do is they allow one bone to slide over the other because the sutures are yet not tight. So because of this loose tissue in between, one bone can slide over another. So when a bone slides over another, what it does is it makes the entire skull a bit smaller. The diameter of the skull gets a little smaller. So it makes it easier for the baby to navigate the birth canal. So this process of sliding off the skull bones over one another is known as molding. So this is another function of the fontanelles. One of the things we can use as physicians, which we can use because of the presence of fontanelles, is that if a child is dehydrated, because inside the brain you have, and covering the brain on the outside also, you have a fluid which is called cerebrospinal fluid. So if a child is dehydrated, the amount of fluid also decreases. So the fontanelle will be depressed. So it will go down like that. So if you feel the soft spot, usually you should be able to feel this fontanelle at level with the rest of the bones. But in dehydration, that soft spot is a bit depressed. So as you're getting tests done, this is a quick clinical way of evaluating whether a child is properly hydrated or not. Because if a child is dehydrated, that fontanelle will feel depressed. On the other hand, if let's say a child has meningitis or something like that, where the intracranial pressure, that means the pressure inside the skull, increases, and in the brain it increases. Since the pressure has increased, what will it do? It will make the fontanelle bulge. So again, by feeling the fontanelle, if it's bulging, it could be a sign of some problem in the brain or overhydration. Let's say you're giving the child intravenous fluids, you're giving it too much, the fontanelle is bulging. So you can check the hydration of the child, you can check the cerebrospinal fluid pressure, but these are diagnostic things that you use because it's there. So this is not a function of the fontanelles, it's just that because the fontanelle is there, we kind of use them. The function of the fontanelle is to allow for brain and skull growth and to allow for molding during the process of labor. Okay? So now we are looking at an adult skull. So when you look at the adult skull, this part here is called the vault of the skull. This area is the base of the skull. This part here is the facial skeleton. So there are 8 cranial bones that you have and about 14 facial bones. And in the lecture, we are not going to do in any of these individual bones, but we'll do some things. For example, between the bones, the bones form joints. So between them, you have joints which are known as sutures. So this one is called the coronal suture. The suture which is present here, there's a suture right in the middle up here. This suture here is called the sagittal suture. And this suture here is called the lambdoid suture. And up here, this suture is called the squamous suture. So there are many more sutures, but these are some important sutures which kind of allow two of the skull bones to get, 2 or more of the skull bones to articulate or come close to each other to form a joint. Now if you remove this top of the skull, which is called the skull cap, and you look into the inside of this base of the skull, you can see that there are 3 kind of little depressions which are known as cranial fossae. So these are called cranial fossa. A fossa is a depression. This will be anterior, this part will be called the middle, this will be called the posterior cranial fossa. And in this posterior cranial fossa, you have a huge opening which is known as the foramen magnum. The word magna means big. Foramen means an aperture or opening. So this is the foramen magnum which you see in this bone here called the occipital bone. And this allows the lower end of the brain, that lower end of the brain is known as the medulla. It allows the lower end of the brain called the medulla oblongata or just medulla to pass through, and along with it the vertebral blood vessels. So it allows these structures to pass through this opening. So again, wherever I've mentioned an opening and I'm telling you about structures passing through, it's important that you know these. Now, by the side of many of those bones, you also have certain air spaces present. These air spaces are present in 4 of these bones, cranial and facial, and their function is to make the skull a bit lighter. They add resonance to your voice. In fact, when your sinuses are filled with fluid, you may find that your voice has a very nasally kind of quality. So when they are normally filled with air, which is what they should be filled with, that's what gives resonance to your voice. And all of these paranasal sinuses open into the nose. So they all open into the nasal cavity. They all come down and open into the nasal cavity. And the nasal mucosa actually goes in from the nose. The mucosa goes in, lines this cavity and comes out. These openings are very small. You can see here, they're very, very small. So normally when you breathe in air, not only does the nasal mucosa humidify and warm the air, but it also goes inside these cavities which are lined by the same kind of epithelium, which also does the same to warm and humidify it. And so by the time your air, the inspired air goes back into your pharynx, that is your throat, it's nicely humidified. Sometimes because these openings are so narrow, you can understand that if there is a swelling up here, this opening will be closed. And that's when these sinuses keep producing their secretions, but they cannot be poured out. And what happens? The sinuses fill with the fluid, and that's when you get pain. So whenever you have sinusitis, you may have felt pain either up here on the front of your cheek in this area, or you might have had a headache, especially worse in the morning, or pain towards the back of your eyes. And that's because these paranasal sinuses are inflamed. Their openings into the nasal cavity are probably blocked, and you take decongestants for this reason, to decongest that area and allow the drainage to occur. Okay? And the four bones which have these paranasal sinuses are the frontal, the ethmoidal, the sphenoidal, and the maxillary. So these are the four bones which have paranasal sinuses. After the skull, we come down to the vertebral column. Now, when you look at the vertebral column, so if you're looking at the vertebral column straight on from either the front or the back, and this is a front view of the vertebral column, it looks straight. It looks right, like it's lying straight. However, if you were to look at the vertebral column from a side view, and this part is anterior and this part is posterior, notice how the vertebral column is kind of like an S shape. It's kind of curved like this. These are called curvatures of the vertebral column. So there are two types of curvatures. One is known as a primary curvature, which is present at birth. That means the child is born with this kind of curvature. The next one is called a secondary curvature, which is after birth. So something that the child does that brings about this curvature. Very similar to, remember, primary center of ossification before birth and secondary center of ossification after birth. So similar to that, primary curvatures are curvatures which are present at birth. Secondary curvatures are curvatures which develop after birth. So in a child, in a little fetus, if you're looking at the fetus, the entire spine looks concave like this. Okay, the whole spine looks concave if you were looking at it from the side. And in this concavity, the parts which are primary curvature are the sacral and the thoracic region. So here the sacral, here is thoracic and here is sacral. So the sacral and the thoracic, notice how there is a concavity which is anterior. So the concavity is facing anterior. So this concavity is towards the front. So this is a primary curvature. At around 3 months, usually the child begins to hold its head up. So at around 3 months, what happens is the child holds its head up like this. And so now the cervical curvature develops. So here, can you see the cervical curvature has its convexity forwards? Can you see the cervical curvature has its convexity forward? So this is the cervical curvature. Right? It's because you hold your head up like that, so this cervical curvature has its convexity. Usually around 6 months, and any time after 6 months, some children a bit earlier, some later. Around 6 months, the child begins to stand. And when the child stands, it puts weight on its lumbar area. And so now the lumbar curvature becomes convex. And here is the lumbar curvature which becomes convex because of the child standing up. So it's putting weight in the lumbar region, making it convex forwards. So this is another secondary curvature which appears, which is the lumbar one. So the secondary are the cervical and lumbar, the primary are thoracic and sacral. So notice how the thoracic and sacral regions they kind of still remain concave. They are present at birth. The cervical appears after birth, the lumbar also appears after birth, one because of the child holding up its head, the other one because of the child putting weight on the lower part of the vertebral column. This is the reason why when children are born, you're always told to hold their head You know, they say support the head because the child's not able to support the head, so the head is kind of wobbling all over. So you have to put your hand behind the neck to support that head, to give them that support till they are able to hold their head by themselves. Okay? So then let's look at the number of vertebrae which we have. So we have 33 vertebrae, and this is the breakdown. 7 in the cervical region, 12 in the thoracic region to accommodate for the 12 ribs, 5 in the lumbar region, and in the sacrum 5 are present, but they are all fused together to form a bone called the sacrum. And in the coccyx we have 4 vertebrae which are fused together to form the coccyx. So you can see that there are that count adds up to 33. And the way people like to remember is you have breakfast at 7, lunch at 12 o'clock. What do you have at 5? A little snack at 5, and then maybe after the snack you have dinner again at 5, and then, I don't know. I don't have anything beyond that. And then a mid-morning snack if you wake up at 4 o'clock, okay? So, well, if you've got up to here, then you just get the 5 and 4, okay? So, I don't know. If you've come up with a better way of remembering it, let me know. Cocktails at 4 in the morning? Yeah, I mean, that's a bit... Coccyx, okay, coccyx. 4 cocktails, okay, good. Coccyx, 4 cocktails, yeah. At dinner, you have 4 cocktails, maybe that. Something, whatever helps you, okay? So that's how you have... So that's how you calculate the vertebrae. So just remember till here, 7, 12 and 5, and then you've got 9 left, right? So then 5 for sacrum and 4 for coccyx, and then that might be. So let's look at some features of vertebrae, and then we look at a typical vertebra. All vertebrae have these features, and then we look at some which don't have some of these features, or they're a bit modified. All vertebrae have a part, again there will be exceptions to this, they have a part which is present anteriorly, so look here, anterior and posterior. They have a part present anteriorly which is called the body, or which is known as the centrum. And then towards the back, this area, they have a part which is called the vertebral arch. This vertebral arch is made up of a projection which goes right towards the back, which is called the spinous process. In fact, when you feel the back of your body, on your back, when you feel these spinous processes, you all say, oh, I can feel my spine. You actually mean your vertebral column, but truly speaking, you're not feeling your entire vertebral column, but you're only feeling the spines. You're only feeling the spines of the vertebrae. Notice how they stick out, and that's why you're able to feel them at the back, okay? So right in the center is at the back is the spinous process, in the front is the body. On either side, like 2 arms going out horizontally, are these processes which are called the transverse processes. So here we have the 2 transverse processes. Now connecting this vertebral arch with the body is this bar of bone which is known as the pedicle. So connecting this vertebral arch with the body is this bar of bone which is known as the pedicle. And also connecting from the transverse process to the spinous process on either side is this flat plate of bone which is known as the lamina. So this flat plate of bone is called the lamina. So when these 2 laminae actually meet together, that's when you get the spinous process. You may have heard of a condition. How many of you have heard of this condition known as spina bifida? Just one person? Oh, quite a few. Okay, spina bifida. As the name suggests, bifid means 2. So bifid spine, that means the spinous process is actually not single like this, but imagine if the spinous process was like this. So if the 2 laminae did not fuse with one another, can you understand that this would really be open to the outside? And that's why we call it spina bifida. I mean, there are various grades of spina bifida. Now, because of the way this vertebral arch is connected to the body by the pedicles, you can see a little opening present in the center. This opening, because it's inside the vertebra, is known as the vertebral foramen. So this opening is called the vertebral foramen, or even you can think of it as being called the spinal foramen. Because lying inside this vertebral foramen is the spinal cord, and the spinal cord does not extend all the way down. It does not actually go all the way down till the coccyx. It ends at the level of lumbar 1 vertebra, and thereafter there is really a sheaf of nerve fibers, and that sheaf of nerve fibers is called cauda equina. So in the lumbar vertebral foramen and the sacral area, instead of spinal cord, you have cauda equina. Okay, but this area here is meant for spinal cord, or like as I said, in the lower vertebrae, this is for a part of the spinal cord, which is, or the continuation of the spinal cord, known as the cauda equina. Now here, if you look, go back here and you look at this picture, can you see these vertebrae are sitting one on top of each other? So they are articulating with one another. So look at this area. So see this area up here. Okay, so notice how these vertebrae are articulating with one another. So this vertebra, for example, this one is articulating with the vertebra above, and it's articulating with the vertebra below, right? So it's connecting with the vertebra above and connecting with the vertebra below. Wherever a joint is present, or remember we talked earlier, wherever a joint is present, that area becomes smooth, and that area is known as a facet. So if you're looking at it from the side, so let's say here is the body, and we come here, and here is the spinous process of one vertebra, here's another body, and here is the spinous process. So, and here's one, and here's the spinous process. This vertebra has to articulate with this, and this one with this. So this one will have a point where this will articulate with this will have something where it will articulate with this, right? So that they kind of help to form a joint. So each vertebra therefore will have a little process which will go up to articulate with the vertebra above, and it will have a little process below which will articulate with the vertebra below. These processes are called articular processes. So this one is going up, so it will be called superior articular process. The one below will be called inferior articular process. And on the process, you'll have this smooth area which is called the facet, where it can articulate with the vertebra above. And similarly, on the inferior articular process, you'll have up here. So here is the superior articular process and facet. Here is the inferior articular process and facet. So this one will articulate with the vertebra above. This one will articulate with the vertebra below. Okay? So have you understood? So you have to have these facets which are present. Now let's look at some vertebrae which are a bit different. So the first cervical vertebra, or C1, which is called the atlas. This C1 vertebra, notice it doesn't have a body. See this part here, it doesn't have a body. So the C1 is a ring-shaped vertebra. So this is ring-shaped, doesn't have a body. In fact, what happened during development, its body almost dropped down. I mean, that's one way of expressing it. Its body dropped down and fused with the body of the second cervical vertebra. The second cervical vertebra, it's called the axis. So if the body of the first went and dropped down onto the body of the second, so sitting on top of the second is a process which goes up, which is what you see here. That process is called the dens, or also known as the odontoid process. So that's called the dens or the odontoid process. So that is seen in the axis vertebra, which is the C2 vertebra. So these are two special vertebrae. One is ring-shaped because it doesn't have a body. One has its own body, but it's got a little projection because the body of the first cervical came and fused with it. So it looks a bit different because it's got a little projection from its main body, and that's called the dens or odontoid process. And this is the axis vertebra. Now let's look at the various vertebrae and see how we can differentiate between them. So look at all these pictures. They all have a body. They all have this vertebral arch. The transverse process looks a bit different in some of them. In this, the transverse process looks like what I showed you earlier. in this too, except that it's a little smaller or thinner. And in this one, the transverse process kind of seems a little odd. It looks very short, but it's got a hole inside it, right? So when you compare the three types of vertebrae, the cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar, the cervical vertebrae are typically identified by the process of an extra foramen. So they all have this vertebral foramen, but they have an extra foramen in their transverse process. So that extra foramen is called the transverse foramen, or also called foramen transversarium. Another name for it is foramen transversarium. So only cervical vertebrae will have this foramen transversarium. So if we go back and look at the atlas, see, look at the atlas. It's a cervical vertebra, so while it didn't have that body, it still had this foramen transversarium or transverse foramen. Even the atlas does, and the reason you can't see it is because it's hidden. The transverse foramen is up here. They're not showing you the transverse process fully. So the transverse, if I kind of drew it here, it would be somewhere here. If I drew the complete thing, it would be somewhere here. So cervical vertebrae are characterized by the presence of the transverse foramen. They also typically have a spine which is kind of a little forked or bifid at its end up here. It's otherwise fused, but just at its end it may be a little forked. The thoracic vertebrae, its special features are, because this vertebra is in the region of the thoracic cage where ribs articulate with it. So ribs have to attach to the thoracic vertebra. So we will find that on the side of the body and on the transverse process. And you can see some of it over here and here, but if you look at it, it's better seen when you look at it from the side view. On the body, up here and here, and on the transverse process, you have this smooth area present, which is called a facet. So this is called a costal facet. So these are known as costal facets. So you see these costal facets on the body as well as on the transverse process in order to allow for a rib to articulate there. So if I was to draw a rib, if you looked at it from the top, this is how a rib would articulate with the vertebra like this. And if you looked at it from the side view, so a rib would articulate in this fashion. So ribs articulate with the thoracic vertebra, which is why you have these costal facets on the body and on the transverse process. You don't have them in cervical, you do not have them in thoracic. Apart from this, other differences are the body looks more like it's more heart-shaped. The spine is more pointed and going backwards. So you can see that the spine goes backwards. But the main identifying feature are these costal facets. They're only in the thoracic region. Ribs in fetal life actually develop in the cervical area. They also develop in the lumbar area, but they disappear in these. They only remain in the thoracic region. Occasionally, you might see a case where a cervical rib may be present and it may be accidentally discovered on an X-ray. Or it may cause problems if it kind of presses on nerves and blood vessels. But many times it doesn't cause any problems. A lumbar vertebrae is differentiated by elimination. If you do not see transverse foramina in the transverse process, it's not cervical. If you don't see costal facets on the body and transverse process, it's not thoracic. So by the process of elimination, you take a lumbar vertebra. And then you can look for, if it is from the same body, usually a lumbar vertebra is the larger vertebrae of all the vertebrae. It's much larger than thoracic and cervical. Also, the spine is more, instead of being pointed, the spine is kind of more rectangular. So notice the spine is more like a rectangle instead of being pointed like this. And the transverse processes are very small. So notice they're very thin. So these are kind of additional features. But the main thing is no costal facets, no transverse foramen, and that makes it a lumbar vertebrae. I also want you at this point to even pay attention up here to something known as a notch. So if you look at this notch which is present here, where the region of the pedicle, where the pedicle attaches the vertebral arch to the body. So there's this little notch here, and there is a little notch present here, which is not very deep. This one up here is called the superior articular, superior notch. So we'll just call it the superior notch, okay? So when vertebrae sit one on top of the other, like this. So when one vertebra sits one on top of the other, this inferior of one with the superior of the other forms a little foramen on the side. So, sorry, let's go back here. So up here, if I was to draw another vertebra like this and drew this, so you can see because of this vertebra articulating with it, so can you see this notch now gets converted into a foramen, and these foramina are on the sides. And if you look at all these will be the foramina, which are all these foramina which you're seeing on the sides. You can see these which are coming on the right and left, so they'll be on the side. And because these are between vertebrae, we'll call these foramina, we'll call them intervertebral foramina. So these are known as intervertebral foramina. The vertebral foramen is right in the center. Can you see this? This is the vertebral foramen which is right in the center. So when you put vertebrae one on top of the other, all the vertebral foramina which are right in the center line up together, and they form what is known as the vertebral canal. So can you see this? This will be the vertebral canal. So the spinal cord is what travels through the vertebral canal all the way down, and then in the lumbar vertebra it'll be called cauda equina. Through the intervertebral foramina, notice what is coming out through the intervertebral foramina. So having looked at this picture, tell me what passes through the vertebral foramen. Spinal cord. Remember, the vertebral foramen is the spinal cord. I just showed you this picture. This in the center was the vertebral foramen. This is the vertebral foramen. And remember, we said spinal cord passed through it. It becomes a canal when you line up many vertebrae together. Then that foramen has a length now. So we call it a canal. So here, this is the canal all the way through. And see the spinal cord in the vertebral canal, and the canal is only part of the vertebral foramen, because when all the foramina line up together, you call it the vertebral canal. Passing in the intervertebral foramen, which is this area, are these spinal nerves and blood vessels which come out of the spinal cord. So the nerves, spinal nerves and blood vessels will come out through the intervertebral foramen, whereas the cord lies in the vertebral foramen, or when many vertebrae are lined up together, we'll just call that the canal, okay? So it is spinal cord. So here is the sacrum and coccyx, and even in the sacrum, this is where the vertebral foramen will be. So your part of that spinal cord will go all the way down into it, and the nerves will all come out in this part up here. So we have 5 sacral vertebrae which are fused with one another, and then this articulates with the coccyx below, where there are 4 vertebrae which articulate to form the coccyx. And you can see the line of fusion which is there, and these are all the parts where the body are, and these are where all the transverse processes have fused with one another. This projection of the sacrum, this part here is called the promontory because it's projecting. So this area here is known as the sacral promontory. So that was the vertebral column. Then we go to the thoracic cage. Yes?
I thought that the spinal cord didn't come all the way down.
No, so that's why I said the continuation of the spinal cord, which in this case would be the cauda equina. Continue, the cauda equina, yes. So it will be the cauda equina which would be here. So in the thoracic cage, it's made up of the thoracic vertebrae behind or posteriorly. It's made up of the sternum or the breastbone, which consists of three parts. This part here is the first, or the superiormost part is called the manubrium. The middle portion is called the body of the sternum. Where the manubrium and the body meet, this area is known as the sternal angle. This part is a bump which you can feel called the sternal angle, and the second rib you can see articulates here. So here is the second rib, this is the first. This part here is known as the xiphoid process, and between the body and the xiphoid process again is a little joint up here which is called the xiphisternal joint. This joint here between the two would be called the manubriosternal joint. So this joint would be called, which is at the sternal angle, is known as the manubriosternal joint. And this joint here is called the xiphisternal joint. So the sternum is really made of three pieces with a joint between them. Then we have 12 pairs of ribs. And the ribs articulate, at the ends of the ribs you have a bit of cartilage which is hyaline in nature, which is known as the costal cartilage. So in these 12 pairs, the first 7 are called true ribs, because these true ribs articulate posteriorly with the vertebra. So that's why thoracic vertebra have costal facets. So they articulate with the vertebra posteriorly, and anteriorly they articulate directly with the sternum, with either portion of the sternum. So you can see the first 7 are articulating either with manubrium, body or xiphoid process. The false rib, truly speaking, is 8 to 10, not 8 to 12. 8 to 10. These articulate with the vertebra posteriorly, but anteriorly they articulate indirectly with the sternum. So what they do is the 10th, the costal cartilage of the 10th articulates with the costal cartilage of 9th. The costal of 9th articulates with the 8th. And 8th articulates with the costal cartilage of the 7th. And therefore indirectly they go to the sternum. So this is the reason true ribs are often known as vertebrosternal ribs. Because vertebra to sternum. Vertebrosternal ribs. False ribs are called vertebrochondral ribs. Vertebra to costal cartilage. Chondra for cartilage. Vertebrochondral ribs. And the last 2 ribs are called floating ribs because they only articulate with the vertebra posteriorly, as you can see here. They anteriorly, their tips have a little bit of costal cartilage, but they don't articulate with anything anteriorly. So they are floating. So that's why they are called vertebral ribs also, because they are going with the vertebra. Just vertebra. So vertebral ribs. Occasionally, as I said, you may have a rib which might be present in the cervical region. So if there is the cervical vertebra here, occasionally you may have a cervical rib present, maybe accidentally seen on an X-ray, or it may compress blood vessels and nerves which lie in this area, in which case the person presents with symptoms. So that was the axial skeleton. Now when we look at the appendicular skeleton, so let's first start with, this is the skeleton of the limbs. And the limbs are attached to the axial skeleton because the weight is transmitted to the axial skeleton, and it's transmitted by a ring of bone, both for upper and lower limbs, and that ring is known as a girdle. So in the upper limb, the clavicle and the scapula together, the scapula at the back, together form what is called the pectoral girdle. So it is the clavicle on one side and the scapula. So you have the pectoral girdle of this side and then the pectoral girdle of the other side. And if you kind of look at both together, it looks like a whole ring around the body. So that's why this is called the girdle. The primary purpose is weight transmission. So up here you can see that the humerus is articulating with the scapula. But the scapula doesn't articulate with any bone of the axial skeleton. Only the clavicle does. So don't write this down. Pay attention here. Look at the clavicle. It is articulating with the sternum. So this part here is this area here is for the clavicle. So that's why it's called clavicular notch. So here the clavicle is articulating with the sternum. So imagine you are carrying some heavy weight in your with your hand. So the weight will travel all the way from your wrist up your forearm into your arm. From the shoulder, from the humerus, it will go to the scapula. And then it can't go to the axial skeleton. So it has to go some way. The only way it can go is through this clavicle, because the clavicle articulates medially with the scapula and laterally with the medially with the sternum and laterally with the scapula. So the clavicle articulates medially with the sternum and laterally with the scapula. So the weight from the humerus goes into the scapula, and through the scapula, through this process, it goes into the clavicle, through the clavicle, then it gets into the sternum, and that's how it comes to the axial skeleton. Which is why if the clavicle is fractured at any time, you would see that the upper limb droops, the shoulder kind of just drops down because the weight cannot be transmitted. So it's a very important strut which is present there, okay? So that's the pectoral girdle. And we'll see a similar girdle present in the lower limb as well. So here is a picture of the clavicle, as I said earlier, articulates with the sternum medially and the scapula laterally. And this lateral end where it articulates, it's called the acromial end, and it's flat. And medially it's a bit triangular. If you look at the scapula, this is the anterior aspect of the scapula. So always kind of pay attention to the pictures up here. Look at these little parts which are highlighted, which are parts that I really need for you to know. So this little cavity here is called the glenoid cavity. And this glenoid cavity is where the humerus articulates. So if you look at the previous picture, here you can see this area here is the glenoid cavity, which is where the humerus is articulating. So this is where the humerus articulates. And here at its lateral end is this flat process which is called the acromion, and this part articulates with the clavicle. So you can see that the scapula will articulate with the humerus and with the clavicle. And in the lab you do other parts of the scapula. You can see this pointed process which is called the coracoid process. You can see this pointed part, and this area which is kind of like a little shelf which is called the spine of the scapula. So here you can see the scapula is articulating with the clavicle and humerus. The clavicle articulates with the sternum and scapula. So don't memorize this. Always look at a skeleton and you should be able to kind of tell where they articulate. Then when we look at the arm bone, this bone is the humerus. So you see above it articulates with the scapula to form the shoulder joint. Below it articulates with the radius and ulna to form the elbow joint. If you look at the humerus from the anterior aspect, you can see a rounded part which is known as the head of the humerus. And immediately there's a little narrow area which is present here. That narrow area is known as the anatomical neck. Wherever there's a constriction, it's called a neck. Then up here you can see another narrow area which is called the surgical neck. This narrow area is called surgical neck because there are some important blood vessels and nerves related to this area. And the blood vessels are called the axillary artery and the axillary nerve. So axillary nerve and blood vessels are related to this area. So that's why this is called the surgical neck, because if it was fractured, you would have to do surgery in order to kind of, maybe the artery gets torn, so you may have to suture the artery or may have to suture the nerve. So because of these important blood vessels, you have to be careful of this part. At its lower end, you can see this pulley-shaped region which is known as the trochlea. And then you can see a rounded part which is called the capitulum. Always look at these bones in the lab as well so that you are able to identify these parts, because you're pretty much required to know the very same parts in the lab too. Also at the upper end, notice two kind of little bumps present. One is smaller. This smaller one is called the lesser tubercle. This larger one which is present on the lateral side is called the greater tubercle. So you see these tubercles in the humerus. Lesser and greater tubercles. As I said, there are many important nerves related. Here was the axillary nerve and artery. On the posterior aspect of the bone, there is a nerve called the radial nerve which is present there. So again, if children fracture this middle or the shaft of the humerus, the radial nerve could get damaged. On the medial aspect, up here is a nerve which is present, which is called the ulnar nerve. And in fact, many of you may have often felt this jarring sensation if you hit the medial side of your elbow against a hard object. You get this very zing, jarring sensation. And you may have heard of funny bone, right? So it isn't this whole bone. It's not the entire humerus, which is called the funny bone. It's this part, which is known as the medial epicondyle, which is called the funny bone, because this nerve, the ulnar nerve, is related here. It's right directly in contact with bone. So when you hit your medial epicondyle, you actually contude that nerve, and that's what gives that, that little jarring feeling. So you can see 3 nerves and many blood vessels are related to this bone. So any fractures of this bone become quite important. Then when we look at the forearm bones, radius and ulna, and you should remember this from introduction. Remember, in the forearm we said radial was the lateral side. We also called it the radial side. Ulna was the medial side. So the radius and ulna, radius is present laterally, ulna is present medially. Both bones articulate above with the humerus to form the elbow joint. But at the wrist, only the radius articulates with the carpal bone. So this is very important. Only the radius articulates with the carpal bones to form the wrist joint. The ulna does not participate in the wrist joint, because at the lower end of the ulna there's a piece of cartilage which is present here, and that comes between the carpal bones and the ulna. So it doesn't allow the ulna to articulate with the carpal bones. You'll also notice that the 2 bones, to keep the bones together, they are joined by a membrane which is present in between, which is called the interosseous membrane. Interosseous, between bones. So this is known as the interosseous membrane. If you look at the 2 bones, what you will notice is that in the radius, it's flat on the top, and this area is called the head, and just below that area is the neck. In the case of the ulna, it's kind of got a little beak-like appearance. So there's a little beak-like appearance. Sometimes we call it looks like a wrench. And the head of the ulna, so wherever I have these areas boxed in, it's important for you to look at this. So notice how the head of the radius is at the upper end. That means it's towards the elbow. Whereas the head of the ulna is at the lower end. It's towards the wrist. And both bones have a little projection which comes down, a tiny little projection which comes down, which is known as the styloid process. So both bones have a styloid process at the lower end, styloid process at the lower end. Now for this section, it's really important for you to be looking at these bones, looking at these various labels, and you do it in the lab as well. So then that way you can kind of cement what you're learning in the lecture with what you do in the lab, so that if you're asked a question that if the head of the radius was fractured, where would you look for the fracture? Towards the elbow end or towards the wrist end? And only if you kind of understand this or look at the picture carefully would you be able to answer that. Okay? So please make sure you kind of look at these things. So notice how head of the radius is at the upper end, head of the ulna at the lower end, but the 2 styloid processes are at the lower end of both bones. Then when we do the bones of the hand, and there is some similarity here with that of the foot, we have 8 carpal bones, 5 metacarpals and 14 phalanges. In the foot too, we have it similar, except instead of carpals, we call them tarsals. So there we'll see that there are 7 tarsals, but otherwise everything else is similar. So you can see the 5 metacarpals. All the fingers have 3 phalanges except the thumb, which has 2. And here notice how the radius is articulating with these bones to form the wrist joint. Notice the ulna is not articulating. So see, there's a gap present up here. You don't need to know the individual carpal bones for the lecture. or even for the lab for that matter. Then when we look at the lower limb, just as we had a girdle in the upper limb, the lower limb also has a girdle. In this case, we call it the pelvic girdle. So this pelvic girdle is the two hip bones together. So you can see it is pretty much circular. When we add the sacrum in between, then the entire structure is called the pelvis. So when you talk of the bony pelvis, then you mean the two hip bones and the sacrum together. But otherwise, just the two hip bones are called the pelvic girdle. Each hip bone actually is made up of three parts. This flared out area is called the ilium. This part on which you sit is known as the ischium. And this part which articulates with the one on the other side, this area is called the pubis. And just like in the humerus, you had a little fossa for articulation, not humerus, in the scapula, you had a little fossa for articulation with the humerus. Similarly here, you have a fossa which is called the acetabular fossa, so that the femur articulates here. So you have the lower limb bone which is called the femur articulates here to form the hip joint. So here you can look, so here I'm showing you the entire pelvis. So you can see that you have the two hip bones and the sacrum in between. And there is a difference between the male and the female pelvis. One of the most important differences is this area which is present between the two pubic bones, which is known as the pubic arch, or also called subpubic arch because it's below. So this in females, notice this arch is much wider, so it's obtuse in females and acute in males. So usually we kind of give this example of the forefinger, the middle finger and the thumb. So this is for females and this part is for males. Plus in males, this region which is called the iliac fossa is much deeper because these ends of the bone are more turned in, which is why they have narrower hips. In women, this iliac fossa is much shallower. There are other differences that I have for you in your notes, so kind of take a look at it. The most important difference by just looking at the two pels, which you can tell, is this pubic arch. Now when we look at the lower limb bones, the thigh bone, which is the femur, very similar to the humerus. So there was one bone there, one bone here. So femur forms the hip joint with the hip bone above. It forms the knee joint below with the patella and another bone called the tibia, which is the bone of the leg. Just as the humerus had tuberosities, remember those little projections, here also you have those bumps, but you don't call them tuberosities because they are much larger. So you call them trochanters. So these are called greater and lesser trochanter. So if you got a question, where would you find, and you cannot interchange the name. You can't call a tuberosity a trochanter. So if you are asked, where would you see the lesser trochanter, your answer has to be femur. You get it? If it's where do you see lesser tubercle, then it would be humerus. And towards the end, at the lower part, the femur has these little large round protuberances which are known as condyles. So you can see this area is called condyle. And to the side of each condyle is a little more projected area which is known as epicondyle. So you can see epi means above. So above the condyle is this area present here which is known as the epicondyle. So very, very similar. The femur also has a head. It also has a neck. Very similar. And the patella is a sesamoid bone. If you remember when we did bones, we talked about the patella. Then when we look at tibia and fibula, very similar to the forearm. So remember you had two bones, radius and ulna. If you remember the ulna, which was the most slender of the bones, only took part in one joint, apart from joining with the radius. It only took part in the elbow, not in the wrist. Here in the tibia and fibula, the tibia is the bigger bone, the fibula is the smaller bone. The fibula does not take part in the knee joint, but it takes part in the ankle. So again, it takes part in only one of the joints up, main joints up here. And again, both of them are held together, as you can see, by the interosseous membrane. So again, notice a similarity with the upper limb. So in the forearm bones, you had one medial, one lateral. Here also one medial, one lateral. The bigger bone in the forearm, which was radius, took part in elbow and wrist. The bigger bone takes part in knee and ankle. The smaller, thinner bone takes part only in the ankle, not up there with the knee joint. And look at the image so you can see that. The foot, when we look at the foot, very similar to the hand, except instead of 8 carpals, we have 7 tarsal bones, of which this huge tarsal bone is called the calcaneus, which you should know. The heel bone is called the calcaneus. And this bone which sits on top, which is the one which forms the ankle joint. The talus is the one which forms the ankle joint with the tibia and the fibula. So this is where the talus is present, forming the ankle joint. So here with the talus. This is another pretty large bone. So here's the calcaneus and the talus, and otherwise you have 5 metatarsals, 14 phalanges. So very similar to the skeleton of the hand, except one less bone in the ankle. You have 8 carpals, but you have 7 tarsal bones.